Behind deceptively innocent faces lie 10 cases so profoundly disturbing that they broke veteran detectives, leaving behind crime scenes with realities so severe that platform guidelines restrict us from showing you the unfiltered devastation. We are examining the cold, documented facts of these young offenders, stepping directly into the forensic timeline of events to see exactly where the illusion of a normal life fractured. The sprawling Dutch colonial home situated at 112 Ocean Avenue in the quiet, affluent village of Amityville, New York, stood as a testament to suburban prosperity in the autumn of 1974. Behind its iconic quarter-moon windows resided the DeFeo family, a seemingly typical American household consisting of parents Ronald Sitter and Louise, alongside their 5 children Ronald Jr., Dawn, Allison Mark, and young John Matthew. On the surface, the family enjoyed the fruits of a successful car dealership business, possessing multiple vehicles, a comfortable lifestyle, and a prominent position within their close-knit Long Island community. The large, multi-story house provided ample space for the growing family, featuring individual bedrooms that offered a false sense of security and privacy for the children. Neighbors viewed them through the lens of ordinary suburban existence, completely unaware of the underlying domestic tensions and the profound psychological deterioration occurring within the walls of their comfortable estate. The younger children attended local schools and participated in community activities, cementing their roles as innocent fixtures in a neighborhood characterized by manicured lawns and peaceful streets. Ronald Cern was known as a demanding patriarch who provided heavily for his dependents, establishing a strict hierarchy that dominated the daily routines of the household. Louise maintained the home, ensuring the family projected an image of stability and respectability to the outside world, effectively masking any internal discord. For the community, the DeFeo residence was simply another prosperous home on a desirable street, devoid of any indicators that it was about to become the epicenter of one of the most thoroughly documented crime scenes in American history. This carefully constructed facade of upper-middle-class normalcy served to amplify the sheer shock of the violence that was secretly brewing, setting a devastating contrast between the peaceful exterior of the property and the horrific reality that would soon unfold in the early hours of a cold November morning. The fragile illusion of suburban tranquility shattered irrevocably at approximately 6:30 p.m. on November 13, 1974, when 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. burst through the doors of Henry's Bar, a local establishment situated just down the street from his family home. In a state of apparent hysteria, he frantically announced to the patrons that his parents had been shot, pleading for immediate assistance and prompting a small group of locals to rush back to the residence at 112 Ocean Avenue. Upon entering the silent, darkened house, the individuals were confronted with an incomprehensible scene of mass devastation that immediately halted their advance and prompted an urgent, desperate call to the Suffolk County Police Department. Responding officers arrived to find a crime scene of unimaginable scale, systematically moving from room to room to discover the lifeless bodies of all 6 DeFeo family members, each murdered while they slept in their respective beds. The victims, ranging from the parents in the master bedroom to the youngest children in their separate quarters, had all suffered fatal gunshot wounds. Yet the house displayed no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on the victims, and no indications of forced entry. The sheer magnitude of the violence, executed with such cold precision in a quiet residential neighborhood, instantly transformed the property into a high-profile forensic puzzle that overwhelmed initial responders. Investigators meticulously documented the positioning of the bodies, noting the chilling reality that every single victim was found lying face down, a detail that suggested a methodical and uncontested execution rather than a chaotic home invasion. The localized panic spread rapidly through the community as news of the massacre leaked, leaving neighbors terrified that a heavily armed, highly organized killer or group of killers was actively roaming their streets. As crime scene technicians began the grueling process of gathering physical evidence, photographing blood spatter patterns, and cataloging the immediate environment, the initial assessment pointed to a targeted assassination. This provocative incident marked the absolute point of no return for the investigation, shifting the focus from a local tragedy to a sprawling, high-stakes homicide inquiry that demanded immediate answers from the only surviving member of the immediate family. As the meticulously detailed forensic investigation gained momentum, detectives transported Ronald DeFeo Jr. to the local precinct, initially treating him as a vulnerable surviving victim in need of police protection. During the preliminary interviews, Ronald constructed a narrative pointing toward a professional organized crime hit, specifically naming a known mob associate named Louis Fellini as the primary suspect who allegedly held a grudge against the DeFeo family. The Suffolk County investigators diligently pursued this lead, dedicating significant resources to verifying the mob involvement theory, while simultaneously delving deeper into the physical evidence left behind at the sprawling Amityville estate. However, the forensic analysis soon began to heavily contradict Ronald's carefully articulated timeline, particularly concerning the exact time of death for the 6 victims. Ronald claimed he had awakened early, found his family asleep, and left for work around 1600 a.m., but the medical examiner's assessment of rigor mortis and body temperature firmly placed the time of the murders several hours earlier, around 3:15 a.m. Furthermore, detectives noted suspicious inconsistencies in Ronald's demeanor and his changing explanations regarding his whereabouts throughout the day of the murders, prompting them to transition his status from a protected witness to a primary person of interest. The investigation took a critical leap forward when a methodical search of the surrounding area led police to Amityville Creek, where they recovered a discarded .35 caliber lever-action Marlin rifle, which ballistics experts quickly and definitively matched to the specific ammunition casings found scattered across the DeFeo home. This crucial piece of physical evidence directly connected to the family's own property, combined with the complete lack of physical evidence supporting an external break-in or a professional mob hit squad, severely compromised the young man's defensive narrative. Detectives systematically dismantled the false leads, corroborating the physical evidence with witness statements that further isolated Ronald's movements and undermined his alibi. The methodical tightening of the investigative net created an atmosphere of intense psychological pressure, setting the stage for a crucial interrogation where the weight of the accumulated forensic facts would be directly weaponized against his crumbling, fabricated story. The crescendo of the investigation occurred within the sterile confines of the interrogation room, where seasoned detectives confronted Ronald DeFeo Jr. with the overwhelming mountain of contradictory physical evidence they had painstakingly assembled. The investigators meticulously laid out the unyielding timeline established by the medical examiner, explicitly demonstrating how the biological realities of the victims' bodies rendered his early morning departure story an absolute scientific impossibility. They presented the recovered .35 caliber Marlin rifle, directly challenging his claims of an outside mob hitman by proving the weapon belonged to the household and was inextricably linked to the precise ballistic signatures found at the crime scene. As the detectives methodically cornered him with undeniable facts, pointing out his deliberate attempts to dispose of the murder weapon and his blood-stained clothing, the psychological strain of maintaining the complex fabrication finally fractured his resolve. The pivotal breakthrough arrived when Ronald's elaborate defense mechanism completely collapsed, leading to a chilling and comprehensive confession where he admitted to systematically moving through his own home and executing his parents and siblings. He detailed the horrific sequence of events, describing how he utilized the rifle to end 6 lives with chilling efficiency, famously stating to the stunned investigators that once he began firing the weapon, he found himself entirely unable to stop. This staggering admission removed all lingering ambiguity from the case, transforming a mysterious mass murder investigation into the grim reality of a familial annihilation perpetrated by the eldest son. The confession illuminated the darkest corners of the crime, providing the final puzzle pieces that aligned perfectly with the blood spatter analysis, the positioning of the victims, and the localized nature of the violence. Detectives secured the signed statement, effectively closing the investigative loop and ensuring that the perpetrator of one of the most shocking crimes in New York history was firmly in custody. This definitive moment of truth brought an abrupt end to the frantic manhunt for phantom killers, grounding the tragedy in the grim, verifiable actions of a single, deeply disturbed individual who had decimated his own bloodline. The judicial culmination of the Amityville massacre commenced in late 1975, where the prosecution presented an airtight case, built upon the concrete foundation of forensic evidence and the defendant's own detailed confession. In a desperate bid to evade maximum culpability, Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s defense counsel mounted an insanity plea, arguing that auditory hallucinations and malevolent voices had commanded him to carry out the systematic executions of his family members. However, the prosecution systematically dismantled this psychiatric defense by highlighting the calculated, highly rational steps Ronald took to conceal his involvement, including thoroughly cleaning the crime scene, taking a shower, discarding the murder weapon in a specific location, and meticulously fabricating a complex alibi involving organized crime. The court recognized that these deliberate actions of evidence tampering and misdirection demonstrated a clear, undeniable consciousness of guilt, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he fully understood the criminality of his actions at the time of the murders. The jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense, returning guilty verdicts on 6 counts of second-degree murder, which subsequently resulted in the judge handing down 6 concurrent sentences of 25 years to life in a maximum security state penitentiary. Ronald DeFeo Jr. remained incarcerated until his death in custody in 2021, leaving behind a legacy defined strictly by the brutal, verifiable facts of his crimes, entirely separate from the lucrative supernatural hoaxes and haunted house franchises that later exploited the address. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue was eventually sold, renovated, and renumbered by subsequent owners, desperately seeking to distance the property from its macabre history, though the architectural footprint remains a quiet monument to the 6 lives extinguished there. The undeniable reality of the case serves as a permanent, sobering reminder for law enforcement that the most profound acts of evil are often rooted in human malice rather than paranormal fiction. As we close the file on the devastating reality of the DeFeo household, the focus shifts entirely from historical familial annihilation to the modern era, where the digital landscape provided a new, unprecedented hunting ground for our next subject. The transition from physical neighborhoods to the expansive anonymity of the internet perfectly frames the chilling investigation of Miranda Barber, a case that proves the dark evolution of predatory behavior in the 21st century. In the seemingly unremarkable towns of central Pennsylvania, the Newlid couple Miranda and a lit barber projected an image of mundane, quiet domesticity that completely masked their deeply disturbing shared interests. Miranda, a 19-year-old who had relocated from Alaska, carried a turbulent personal history marked by transient living situations and a dark fascination with violence that she carefully concealed beneath a youthful, unassuming exterior. She had recently married 22-year-old Alit, and the two quickly formed an isolated, co-dependent bond that nurtured their most dangerous psychological impulses away from the scrutiny of family and friends. Together, they settled into a small apartment in Selinsgrove, attempting to navigate the early days of their marriage while secretly indulging in morbid fantasies that steadily escalated from idle conversation into concrete planning. To the outside world, they were simply another young couple struggling to establish themselves financially, completely unremarkable in their daily routines and interactions with the local community. However, within the confines of their private relationship, Miranda positioned herself as a dominant force, manipulating Alit's devotion to her into a willing participation in her increasingly violent ideations. The couple began to view the digital landscape not as a tool for communication, but as a vast, anonymous hunting ground where they could safely target vulnerable individuals without raising immediate suspicion. They meticulously discussed the mechanics of taking a human life, transforming their abstract, macabre conversations into a shared, tangible goal that they believed would solidify their matrimonial bond. This toxic echo chamber of shared sociopathy, allowed them to rationalize their darkest desires, entirely detaching themselves from the fundamental empathy that prevents ordinary citizens from crossing the line into predatory behavior. Their quiet Pennsylvania apartment effectively served as the incubator for a premeditated thrill kill, setting a deeply unsettling stage where a mundane marriage actively weaponized itself against an unsuspecting public. The insidious reality of their planning materialized into a tangible tragedy in November 2013, when 42-year-old Troy LaFerrara, a married man from Port Trevorton, Pennsylvania, vanished without a trace, triggering an immediate and frantic search by his terrified wife. LaFerrara had established a secret digital life, discreetly browsing the companionship sections of Craigslist, where he unknowingly interacted with a carefully crafted advertisement posted by Miranda Barber under the pseudonym Sylvia. Operating under the guise of offering adult companionship for a fee, Miranda effectively lured LaFerrara into an arranged meeting at a local shopping mall parking lot, a bustling public space chosen specifically to lower his defenses. When LaFerrara failed to return home that evening, his wife immediately contacted local law enforcement, initiating a missing persons investigation that initially struggled to find a starting point due to his seemingly routine daily schedule. The chilling shift from a standard missing persons case to a homicide investigation occurred just days later, when a passing motorist discovered LaFerrara's lifeless body dumped unceremoniously in a residential backyard in Sunbury. First responders arriving at the grim scene discovered that the victim had suffered multiple, severe stab wounds, indicating a highly intimate and violent confrontation that definitively ruled out any possibility of an accidental death or a standard robbery gone wrong. The sheer brutality of the attack, executed with a localized frenzy, suggested a crime driven by a specific, terrifying intent rather than a random act of street violence. Investigators immediately secured the perimeter, bringing in forensic teams to meticulously comb the area for any physical trace evidence. Though the remote nature of the dumping ground provided very few immediate physical clues, this devastating discovery marked the absolute point of no return for the local police department, forcefully shifting their operational focus toward tracking the final, hidden movements of a man who had seemingly walked willingly into a fatal trap. The discovery of the body ignited a sense of intense urgency within the community, as detectives realized that a methodical, opportunistic predator was actively utilizing the internet to successfully bait and execute local residents. Confronted with a brutalized victim and a localized dumping site, detectives immediately pivoted their investigative strategy toward the digital realm, securing subpoenas for Troy LaFerrara's cellular phone records to retrace his final communications. The telecommunications data provided a critical breakthrough, revealing a sequence of calls made to a prepaid cellular phone number on the exact day of his disappearance. Directly linking the victim to the anonymous Craigslist advertisement, investigators painstakingly traced the digital footprint of the email address associated with the Sylvia persona, successfully cutting through the layers of online anonymity to connect the digital breadcrumbs directly to Miranda Barber's IP address. With a definitive digital connection established, law enforcement strategically monitored the Barber's movements, gathering auxiliary evidence and carefully building a comprehensive profile of the young couple before moving in for initial questioning. When detectives finally brought Miranda and Alidi in for formal interviews, the young couple initially presented a united front, offering a fabricated story about purchasing items at the mall and flatly denying any knowledge of LaFerrara's murder. However, seasoned investigators systematically dismantled their alibi by cross-referencing their statements with cellular tower ping data, which undeniably placed both Miranda and Alit in the precise vicinity of the crime scene during the established window of death. The psychological pressure mounted as detectives played the two spouses against one another, subtly highlighting the glaring inconsistencies in their individual timelines and emphasizing the overwhelming weight of the digital telecommunications evidence. A subsequent forensic search of the Barber's vehicle yielded devastating results, as crime scene technicians uncovered trace amounts of LaFerrara's blood concealed deep within the upholstery of the front passenger seat. This undeniable physical link combined with the digital trail, severely compromised the couple's carefully constructed narrative of innocence, forcing them into a defensive posture as the walls of the interrogation room closed in. The methodical alignment of the cyber investigation with hard, biological evidence completely eliminated any remaining ambiguity, setting the stage for a climactic confrontation that would expose the full, horrifying extent of their premeditated thrill kill. The absolute climax of the investigation materialized when the overwhelming convergence of digital surveillance and forensic blood evidence finally broke the Barbers' resolve, leading to their formal arrest for the premeditated murder of Troy LaFerrara. Confronted with the inescapable reality of their impending incarceration, Alit Barber fractured under the intense interrogation, formally confessing to investigators that the couple had murdered LaFerrara strictly for the shared thrill of taking a human life. He provided a chillingly detailed account of the crime, describing how he had hidden silently beneath a blanket in the back seat of the vehicle, while Miranda drove the unsuspecting victim to a secluded location. According to the harrowing confession, Miranda initiated the brutal attack by stabbing LaFerrara in the front seat, at which point Alit emerged from his hiding place, using a cord to strangle the victim and prevent any chance of escape or defense. However, the most shocking twist in the case occurred shortly after their incarceration, when Miranda initiated an unsolicited, high-profile interview with a local newspaper from within the confines of her prison cell. In a startling attempt to manipulate her public narrative and establish a terrifying legacy, she confidently claimed to be a prolific serial killer, boasting that she had murdered at least 22 other individuals across multiple states, from Alaska to North Carolina. She alleged that her participation in a violent, satanic cult during her early youth had initiated her into a lifestyle of serial homicide, suggesting that LaFerrara was merely the latest victim in a vast, undiscovered string of brutal killings. This sensational, highly publicized confession instantly propelled the local homicide case into the national spotlight, forcing the FBI and law enforcement agencies across the country to desperately scramble to verify her sweeping, horrific claims. Investigators in multiple jurisdictions initiated comprehensive reviews of cold cases, missing persons reports, and unsolved homicides, attempting to corroborate her timeline and match her geographical movements to known victims. This massive, unprecedented sudden pivot in the investigation transformed Miranda from a localized thrill killer into a potential apex predator, holding the terrifying possibility that she was one of the most prolific female serial killers in American history. Despite the massive allocation of federal and local investigative resources directed toward verifying her expansive serial killer claims, authorities ultimately concluded that Miranda Barber's boastful confessions were entirely fabricated. Extensive deep dives into her geographical history, financial records, and the national database of unsolved homicides yielded absolutely no physical or circumstantial evidence linking her to any other murders, aside from the tragic death of Troy LaFerrara. Investigators officially dismissed her claims as the grandiose delusions of an attention-seeking manipulator attempting to artificially inflate her criminal notoriety and strike fear into the general public from behind bars. Stripped of her manufactured serial killer mythology, the stark, verifiable reality remained that Miranda and Alit Barber were simply two deeply disturbed individuals who had successfully executed a single, highly premeditated act of violence. Facing the insurmountable weight of their own confessions and the airtight forensic evidence, both husband and wife eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, choosing to avoid the spectacle of a high-profile trial that could have resulted in the death penalty. The presiding judge subsequently sentenced both Miranda and Alit to serve life in prison, without the possibility of parole, permanently removing them from society, and ensuring they would spend the remainder of their natural lives within the Pennsylvania penal system. The LaFerrara family was left to navigate the permanent, devastating aftermath of a crime born entirely out of senseless malice, finding only a small measure of closure in the finality of the life sentences handed down by the court. The case stands today as a grim, sobering warning regarding the inherent dangers of anonymous digital encounters, highlighting how the internet can be effortlessly weaponized by predators to lure unsuspecting victims into fatal traps. Yet, while the Barber case utilized the cold anonymity of the web to orchestrate a stranger's demise, other equally disturbing crimes are rooted entirely in the volatile, toxic dynamics of established interpersonal relationships. As we pivot from the digital hunting grounds of Pennsylvania to the quiet, snow-covered roads of rural Wisconsin, we must examine the heavily fabricated narrative of Ezra McCandless, where the dangerous intersection of obsession, infidelity, and premeditated violence created a forensic puzzle that completely dismantled a young woman's elaborate facade of victimhood. In the quiet, tightly knit community of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, the social dynamics of young adults often intersected in complex, overlapping circles, creating an environment where personal relationships were intensely scrutinized. At the center of one particularly volatile social web was 20-year-old Ezra McCandless, a charismatic but deeply troubled young woman who navigated a chaotic romantic life defined by manipulation and emotional instability. Ezra, who had previously identified under different names and genders before settling on her current identity, maintained a serious, long-term relationship with Jason Mengel, a local man who provided a sense of stability that she frequently undermined. However, beneath the surface of this primary relationship, Ezra actively cultivated a clandestine, highly charged affair with Alex Woodworth, a 24-year-old substitute teacher and local barista known for his intellect and gentle demeanors. The tension between these competing romantic entanglements steadily intensified throughout the early months of 2018, as Ezra struggled to control the narrative she fed to both men, creating a toxic atmosphere of jealousy, suspicion, and hidden agendas. Alex, seeking clarity and increasingly uncomfortable with the deceitful nature of their arrangement, began pulling away from Ezra, a rejection that she perceived not as a boundary, but as a profound personal attack. To the surrounding community of friends and acquaintances, the situation appeared to be merely the messy, dramatic fallout of young love, completely masking the dangerous psychological deterioration occurring within Ezra's mind. She began documenting her spiraling thoughts in hidden journals, meticulously outlining her deepening obsession with Alex and her desperate, aggressive need to maintain absolute control over his actions and affections. This volatile love triangle, operating quietly beneath the peaceful veneer of a Midwestern college town, served as the unseen pressure cooker for a tragedy, slowly aligning the elements for a violent confrontation that would permanently shatter the lives of everyone involved. The simmering tension erupted into a bizarre and horrifying public spectacle on the late afternoon of March 27, 2018, violently disrupting the routine operations of a rural dairy farm located in Dunn County. A local farmer was startled when Ezra McCandless suddenly materialized out of the heavy brush and approached his property, presenting a deeply disturbing physical state that immediately warranted an emergency response. Ezra was barefoot, covered in thick mud, and bleeding heavily from multiple superficial lacerations across her arms and a distinct, prominent cut carved deeply into her neck. In a state of visible, frantic distress, she desperately informed the bewildered farmer that she had just survived a brutal, unprovoked physical assault perpetrated by her former lover, Alex Woodworth. She claimed that Alex had violently attacked her inside her vehicle, forcing her to aggressively fight for her life and subsequently flee into the desolate, muddy terrain to escape his continued aggression. The farmer immediately contacted emergency services, initiating a rapid response from local law enforcement and paramedics who arrived to secure the distressed young woman and begin treating her visible injuries. The sheer chaotic nature of her appearance and her terrifying account of a violent struggle instantly activated a full-scale police mobilization, transforming the quiet rural landscape into an active, high-stakes crime scene. As paramedics transported Ezra to a nearby medical facility for emergency care, Dunn County Sheriff's deputies rapidly mobilized to locate the abandoned vehicle, and more importantly, to apprehend the alleged violent aggressor, Alex Woodworth. This dramatic, blood-soaked emergence from the wilderness served as the undeniable inciting incident, instantly forcing investigators to blindly step into a chaotic narrative heavily controlled by a self-proclaimed victim who had just set the parameters of a massive manhunt. Armed with Ezra's initial, frantic account, a team of Dunn County deputies meticulously scoured the rural, muddy backroads, eventually locating her abandoned vehicle deeply entrenched in a remote, isolated patch of soft dirt. As investigators approached the heavily muddied car, they made a devastating discovery that immediately elevated the case from a violent assault to a catastrophic homicide investigation. The lifeless body of Alex Woodworth was found partially hanging out of the rear passenger side door. The crime scene presented a brutal, undeniable reality. Alex had sustained 16 severe stab wounds, primarily concentrated on his head, neck, and torso, indicating a highly intimate, frenzied, and aggressively violent physical confrontation. However, as seasoned crime scene technicians began meticulously processing the physical evidence within and around the vehicle, glaring inconsistencies immediately began to deeply fracture Ezra's established narrative of self-defense. Blood spatter analysts noted that the distribution of blood within the car's interior strongly indicated that Alex was the victim of a sudden, unprovoked attack, rather than the primary aggressor in a chaotic struggle. Furthermore, the medical personnel treating Ezra raised serious, documented concerns regarding the precise nature of her injuries, noting that the lacerations on her arms and neck presented textbook characteristics of deliberate, carefully executed self-infliction rather than defensive wounds sustained during a frantic fight for survival. The investigation took a critical, damning turn when detectives executed search warrants on Ezra's electronic devices and personal belongings, uncovering a trove of hidden journals and digital communications. These materials provided an unfiltered, highly disturbing window into her psychological state, revealing a meticulously documented obsession with Alex, deep-seated resentment regarding his attempts to distance himself, and a clear, undeniable motive for premeditated violence. Detectives systematically correlated the physical evidence, the blood spatter analysis, the nature of the wounds, and the psychological profile built from her journals, slowly realizing that they were not investigating a victim's desperate survival, but a calculated, brutal execution disguised as self-defense. The climax of the investigation arrived precisely during the intense scrutiny of the courtroom, where the prosecution systematically dismantled Ezra McCandless's carefully constructed, heavily publicized facade of victimhood in front of a jury. The trial served as a masterclass in forensic deconstruction, as the state brought forward medical examiners, blood spatter experts, and behavioral analysts to present an impenetrable wall of empirical evidence against the defendant. The prosecution meticulously demonstrated how the physical geometry of the blood spatter inside the vehicle completely contradicted Ezra's physical demonstration of the alleged attack, proving scientifically that she held the dominant, aggressive position during the stabbing. Crucially, the medical experts provided damning testimony regarding the specific angles, depth, and hesitation marks surrounding the lacerations on Ezra's body, definitively concluding for the jury that the wounds were absolutely self-inflicted in a deliberate, calculated attempt to stage a crime scene. Furthermore, the prosecution introduced the most damaging piece of evidence, Ezra's own journals. Reading aloud the passages where she expressed intense anger toward Alex and documented her manipulative tendencies, completely shattering the illusion of the innocent, battered woman. When Ezra chose to take the witness stand in her own defense, the subsequent cross-examination proved disastrous. The prosecutor aggressively highlighted her constantly shifting timelines, her documented history of lying to both Jason and Alex, and the physical impossibility of her narrative. Under the intense, unforgiving pressure of the cross-examination, her demeanor fluctuated wildly, exposing the manipulative, highly controlled persona that the forensic evidence had already laid bare for the courtroom to see. This dramatic courtroom confrontation effectively stripped away the final layers of her deception, leaving the jury with a clear, undeniable portrait of a calculated killer who had brutally murdered her former lover and then callously mutilated herself to escape justice. Following the exhaustive presentation of forensic evidence and the devastating cross-examination, the jury deliberated and swiftly returned a definitive verdict, finding Ezra McCandless guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. In early 2020, the presiding judge handed down a severe sentence, condemning her to life in prison with the first possibility of parole set after 50 years, effectively ensuring she would spend the vast majority of her natural life behind bars. The judge's sentencing remarks explicitly condemned her extreme manipulation, highlighting the calculated cruelty of murdering Alex Woodworth and subsequently attempting to assassinate his character by falsely branding him as a violent abuser. The conclusion of the trial provided a necessary, definitive legal resolution for the Woodworth family, who had endured not only the horrific loss of their son, but also the agonizing public spectacle of his murderer attempting to cast him as a villain. For the community of Eau Claire, the verdict served as a chilling, permanent reminder of how deeply manipulative individuals can completely camouflage their violent capabilities beneath layers of manufactured drama and false vulnerability. Ezra's conviction stands as a testament to the crucial importance of objective forensic science in piercing through elaborate fabrications and ensuring that the empirical reality of a crime scene ultimately prevails over a carefully rehearsed narrative. The Wisconsin penal system absorbed the young woman, removing her from the society she had actively manipulated, closing the book on a tragic case of fatal obsession. Yet, as we move away from the fabricated victimhood of Ezra McCandless, we must journey across the globe to Western Australia, where a very different, deeply disturbing dynamic was unfolding. The upcoming case of Gemma Lilly shifts our focus from the chaotic fallout of a broken relationship to the cold, methodical execution of a long-held, deeply psychopathic ambition shared between two unlikely accomplices. In the quiet, sun-drenched suburban streets of Palmyra, Western Australia, the stark contrast between two vastly different lives perfectly illustrated how easily a predatory threat can disguise itself within a normal community. Gemma Lilly, a 26-year-old British expatriate who managed a local supermarket, projected a functional, everyday persona that completely concealed her deeply entrenched, lifelong obsession with extreme violence and serial murder. Beneath the mundane surface of her retail career, Lilly harbored a dark, consuming alter ego she called SOS, a fictional serial killer she had meticulously created, written a book about, and ultimately sought to emulate in the real world. She actively decorated her home with macabre memorabilia, openly expressed her desire to take a human life before she turned 25, and fostered an environment completely detached from normal human empathy. Sharing her residence was 43-year-old Trudy Lennon, an older woman with a history of submission who quickly became entangled in Lily's dark fantasies, acting as an enabler and a willing accomplice to her psychopathic ambitions. Unbeknownst to the surrounding neighborhood, this shared suburban household rapidly devolved into a literal trap, waiting only for a suitably vulnerable individual to fulfill Lily's twisted desire for a thrill kill. Tragically, this role would be forced upon 18-year-old Aaron Pagich, an innocent, deeply trusting young man diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder who lived a quiet life completely devoid of malice. Aaron spent the majority of his time immersed in video games and attending a local college, relying heavily on a small, familiar network of friends and acquaintances to navigate a world he often found overwhelming. His gentle nature and inherent inability to recognize predatory intent made him the ideal, tragic target for two individuals actively seeking to cross the ultimate moral boundary without facing immediate resistance. The intersection of Aaron's innocent vulnerability and Lily's heavily premeditated, violent aspirations set the stage for a catastrophic collision that would permanently shatter the peace of the local community. The devastating disruption to Aaron Pagich's peaceful existence occurred on the morning of June 13, 2016, when he left his home to meet an acquaintance, completely unaware that he was stepping directly into a fatal, meticulously planned snare. When the evening arrived and Aaron failed to return or answer any communications, an immediate, suffocating panic set in among his family members, who understood that such an unannounced absence was entirely contrary to his rigid daily routines. Recognizing the severe vulnerability of his autism diagnosis, His parents wasted no time in contacting the Western Australia police to file a formal missing persons report, stressing the urgent reality that Aaron lacked the basic survival skills to navigate a prolonged, unexpected absence. The local authorities immediately recognized the high-stakes nature of the situation, swiftly elevating the case from a standard disappearance to a critical, urgent search operation focused on a highly at-risk individual. Patrol units canvassed the immediate areas he frequented, distributing photographs and knocking on doors, while investigators began the arduous process of untangling his digital footprint and mapping his anticipated route for that day. The sudden, silent void left by Aaron's disappearance acted as the definitive inciting incident, marking the terrifying point of no return where a predictable, safe routine abruptly transformed into a sprawling forensic mystery. Family members publicly pleaded for information through local media outlets, their desperate appeals painting a heartbreaking picture of a gentle teenager who possessed absolutely no known enemies or reasons to voluntarily vanish. As the hours stretched into days without a single credible sighting or digital trace of the missing teen, the initial hope of a simple misunderstanding completely evaporated, replaced by the grim realization that foul play was an active, highly probable factor. Detectives knew they were racing against an unforgiving clock, forcing them to pivot their strategy toward aggressively tracking the very last moments Aaron was seen alive in the public sphere. This transition from a frantic community search to a targeted police investigation initiated a rigorous examination of surveillance infrastructure, setting the stage for a breakthrough that would lead them directly into the heart of a suburban nightmare. The critical breakthrough in the escalating investigation emerged from the systematic review of security camera footage captured at a shopping center in Quinina, where the electronic eyes of the complex managed to document Aaron Padgett's final known movements. The chilling surveillance video showed the unsuspecting 18-year-old confidently meeting with Trudy Lennon, a woman he tangentially recognized through mutual acquaintances, before willingly getting into a vehicle driven by Gemma Lilly. This undeniable digital evidence provided investigators with a direct, localized target, immediately shifting the entire focus of the massive search effort toward the residence shared by the two women on Broughton Way in Palmyra. When detectives arrived at the property to conduct preliminary interviews and execute their initial search warrants, they were instantly struck by an overwhelming, highly suspicious odor of heavy cleaning chemicals permeating the interior of the house. During the initial questioning, both Lilly and Lennon provided vastly conflicting, illogical narratives regarding their interaction with Aaron, their statements fracturing under the pressure of the indisputable CCTV timeline that placed him directly in their custody. As crime scene technicians expanded their physical search to the exterior of the property, they noticed a freshly laid, uneven patch of concrete and a new tarpaulin covering a specific section of the backyard patio. Furthermore, detectives discovered a deeply unsettling, soundproofed room inside the house, equipped with tarps and restraints, alongside digital communications between the two women that heavily implied the successful execution of a violent, premeditated act. The rapid accumulation of these deeply disturbing physical anomalies, combined with the suspects' crumbling alibis and their documented obsession with serial murder, systematically eliminated any remaining theories of an accidental death or a voluntary disappearance. The tension within the investigation reached an agonizing peak as law enforcement realized that the missing teenager they had been desperately seeking was likely hidden mere feet away beneath the newly altered landscape of the suburban garden. Armed with this terrifying realization, the police secured the perimeter, calling in specialized forensic excavation teams to methodically dismantle the hastily constructed patio and uncover the horrific truth concealed beneath the concrete. The investigation reached its absolute, devastating culmination when forensic teams meticulously broke through the layers of fresh concrete and carefully laid tiles in the backyard, ultimately unearthing a shallow grave containing the lifeless body of Aaron Padgett. The gruesome discovery immediately transformed the property into a high-profile homicide scene, confirming the detectives' worst fears and exposing the terrifying reality of a premeditated thrill kill executed entirely for the psychological gratification of the perpetrators. A subsequent, detailed medical examination of the remains revealed the sheer brutality of the attack, determining that Aaron had been subdued, aggressively stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck, and ultimately garroted with a wire in a horrific realization of Lily's violent fantasies. Confronted with the undeniable, biological reality of the victim's body buried on their property, the fragile alliance between the two women completely imploded, resulting in a series of interrogations where they desperately attempted to shift the primary blame onto one another. However, the overwhelming volume of recovered evidence, including the murder weapons, the specific cleaning supplies used to sanitize the crime scene, and a recorded phone call where Lily openly boasted about experiencing the thrill of the kill, completely negated any attempts at denial. The climax of the case was not merely the physical recovery of the victim, but the chilling, undeniable confirmation of the underlying motive: a deeply innocent, highly vulnerable teenager was targeted and slaughtered simply to allow a psychopathic individual to cross murder off her twisted bucket list. Detectives were forced to confront the absolute, purest form of human malice as they documented how Lily celebrated the heinous act, feeling a profound sense of empowerment and satisfaction in the immediate aftermath of extinguishing Aaron's life. The successful excavation completely shattered Lily's delusion of being an untouchable mastermind, physically tethering her grandiose, violent fantasies to the cold, hard, heavily documented reality of a first-degree murder charge. This pivotal moment of forensic truth brought a definitive, agonizing end to the desperate search for Aaron Padgett, cementing the guilt of his captors and ensuring that their meticulously planned crime would result in their absolute destruction. The undeniable evidence gathered from the improvised grave allowed the prosecution to build an impenetrable case, guaranteeing that both perpetrators would face the full, unyielding force of the Australian justice system for their calculated atrocity. The legal resolution for this horrific crime unfolded in a Western Australian courtroom in 2017, where the prosecution presented a meticulous, evidence-heavy case that left no room for reasonable doubt regarding the premeditated nature of the assassination. Following a grueling trial that publicly exposed the darkest corners of their shared psychological depravity, a jury definitively convicted both Gemma Lilly and Trudy Lennon of the cold-blooded murder of Aaron Padgett. The presiding judge subsequently handed down mandatory life sentences for both women, establishing strict non-parole periods that ensured they would remain incarcerated for decades, effectively neutralizing the threat they posed to the general public. During the sentencing phase, the court explicitly condemned the absolute lack of humanity displayed by the killers, highlighting the profound cruelty of preying upon a disabled teenager to satisfy a fabricated, psychopathic ego. For Aaron's devastated family, the legal victory provided a necessary measure of formal justice. Yet it could never possibly fill the permanent, agonizing void left by the senseless execution of a young man who only ever sought friendship and acceptance. The Palmyra property, once a quiet suburban home, was permanently scarred by its legacy as a slaughterhouse, standing as a grim reminder of the predators that can comfortably hide behind the illusion of middle-class normality. The factual legacy of the case serves as a terrifying case study for law enforcement, demonstrating how dangerous psychological obsessions can seamlessly transition from the realm of fiction into catastrophic, real-world violence when enabled by a willing accomplice. As we close the file on a murder driven by the dark, adult ambition to emulate a serial killer, our investigation must take an even darker turn. Moving away from adult predators targeting the vulnerable, we must now cross the globe to the United Kingdom to examine a tragedy that fundamentally shattered a nation's understanding of innocence, forcing veteran detectives to confront a reality where both the victim and the killers were merely children. The devastating events surrounding the abduction of James Bulger will challenge everything we assume about the nature of childhood, marking a profound shift into one of the most chilling, heavily documented forensic investigations in modern history. The New Strand shopping centre in Bootle, Merseyside, served as the bustling commercial heart of a working-class community in the northwest of England, heavily trafficked by locals running mundane daily errands in the damp chill of February 1993. Among the crowds of shoppers navigating the busy retail corridors was Denise Bogarts, a devoted young mother who was simply trying to complete her household chores accompanied by her vibrant, 2-year-old son, James. James was a highly energetic and curious toddler, possessing the typical boundless enthusiasm of a child his age, which required Denise to maintain a constant, watchful eye as they moved between various storefronts. The environment of the shopping center presented a familiar but chaotic backdrop, filled with the loud echoes of footsteps, overlapping conversations, and the bright, distracting displays of commercial merchandise designed to capture the attention of passing families. For Denise, this was an entirely routine outing. A standard Friday excursion completely devoid of any perceived threat or underlying sense of danger, reflecting the universal trust parents place in the safety of public, crowded spaces. She held her son's hand tightly as they walked, navigating the throngs of people, while mentally checking off the items on her shopping list, perfectly blending into the ordinary rhythm of suburban life. There was absolutely no indication that this specific day would violently rupture the fabric of their lives, nor was there any sign that predators were actively roaming the same commercial corridors. However, sharing that exact same space were 10-year-old John Venables and Robert Thompson, two truants who had spent the morning shoplifting and deliberately causing minor disturbances throughout the complex, entirely unsupervised by any adults. The paths of this loving mother and these two deeply troubled youths were converging in a crowded, highly public arena, perfectly illustrating how the most catastrophic moments in forensic history often begin in the most remarkably unremarkable settings. This bustling community hub, designed for commerce and social interaction, was silently transforming into the staging ground for a tragedy so severe that it would permanently alter the global discourse regarding childhood innocence and criminal culpability. The fragile illusion of safety evaporated in a terrifying, imperceptible fraction of a second when Denise entered a busy butcher's shop on the lower level of the shopping precinct to make a quick purchase. Needing to physically reach into her purse to retrieve her wallet to pay the cashier, she momentarily released her tight grip on James's hand, trusting that the toddler would remain standing quietly by her side for mere moments. In that infinitesimally small window of opportunity, while Denise was entirely distracted by the standard financial transaction at the counter, Venables and Thompson immediately identified the isolated child and decisively made their move. They approached the 2-year-old with a calculated swiftness, gently grasping his hand and leading him out of the store and into the vast, churning crowd of shoppers before anyone could register the abduction. When Denise turned back around after completing her payment, expecting to see her son waiting patiently beside her leg, she was instead met with an empty, terrifying void that instantly triggered a mother's worst physiological panic response. She frantically scanned the immediate area, desperately calling out his name over the ambient noise of the shopping center, her voice rising in pitch as the horrifying reality of his sudden absence began to rapidly set in. The local security personnel were immediately alerted to the situation, initiating a rapid, urgent lockdown of the immediate vicinity and beginning a frantic, physical search of the mall's corridors, restrooms, and exit points. Announcements echoed across the public address system, completely interrupting the commercial atmosphere with the chilling description of a missing toddler wearing a blue coat, bringing the bustling center to an eerie, concerned standstill. This heartbreaking transition from a momentary lapse in physical contact to a full-scale emergency response marked the definitive inciting incident, instantly transforming a routine shopping trip into a high-stakes, agonizing race against time. As the minutes agonizingly ticked by without any sign of the young boy, the initial hope that he had simply wandered off to look at a toy display completely vanished, replaced by the grim, undeniable certainty that he had been intentionally taken by an unknown party, faced with an absolute lack of immediate physical leads within the sprawling complex. Investigators from the Merseyside police swiftly seized the shopping center's comprehensive closed-circuit television recordings to painstakingly retrace the timeline of the disappearance. The meticulous review of the grainy, low-resolution security tapes yielded a discovery so chilling that it momentarily silenced the room of seasoned detectives. The footage clearly depicted little James Bulger being confidently led away by the hand by two older boys. The realization that the abductors were not adult predators, but seemingly children themselves, completely shattered conventional investigative profiling, injecting an unprecedented level of complex psychological horror into the rapidly expanding manhunt. Police immediately released the enhanced, yet still highly blurred stills of the CCTV footage to the national media, initiating a massive public appeal for information that dominated television screens and newspaper front pages across the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, investigators began the arduous, heartbreaking task of mapping the perpetrator's exact route. Discovering that Venables and Thompson had dragged the crying toddler on a tortuous, winding path extending over 2.5 miles through the busy urban streets of Liverpool. During this agonizing journey toward the Walton district, an astonishing 38 independent witnesses later reported seeing the trio. Yet tragically, almost all of them simply assumed it was a case of older siblings tasked with managing a disobedient younger brother. On a few occasions, concerned bystanders actively intervened when they noticed James distressingly crying or sporting minor injuries, but the 10-year-old captors smoothly fabricated highly convincing lies, claiming they had found a lost child and were taking him directly to the local police station. This collective, devastating failure of community intervention highlighted the dangerous assumptions society makes regarding the inherent innocence of children, unwittingly providing the two predators with an impenetrable shield of societal trust as they moved toward their final destination. The investigative tension mounted exponentially as detectives triangulated the witness sightings, slowly realizing that the boys were deliberately leading the toddler away from heavily populated areas and toward the desolate, industrial fringes of the city. Law enforcement officers desperately scoured the canals, abandoned buildings, and railway lines along the established route, fully aware that the survival window for a 2-year-old child in the hands of erratic, highly motivated captors was closing with terrifying speed. The agonizing, relentless search ultimately culminated in a scene of unimaginable devastation 2 days later, when a group of local youths playing near a disused railway line in Walton made a horrifying discovery on the cold steel tracks. The mutilated body of 2-year-old James Bulger was found discarded on the railway embankment, having suffered an onslaught of catastrophic, blunt force trauma that severely tested the emotional resilience of even the most hardened, veteran crime scene technicians. Forensic analysis meticulously documented the sheer savagery of the unprovoked attack, revealing that the toddler had been battered with bricks, heavily assaulted with a heavy iron fish plate, and left deliberately across the tracks to be struck by an oncoming train in a crude attempt to mask the homicide. Armed with enhanced CCTV imagery and an anonymous tip from a neighbor who recognized the clothing of the suspects, police executed a raid that resulted in the unprecedented arrest of 10-year-olds John Venables and Robert Thompson on profound charges of first-degree murder. The interrogations of the two juvenile suspects were an absolute psychological quagmire, requiring specialized child psychologists to assist detectives as they navigated the surreal, chilling experience of questioning prepubescent boys about a sadistic thrill kill. Inside the sterile interview rooms, both boys initially presented a unified front of vehement denial, displaying a highly calculated, manipulative demeanor that stood in stark contrast to their chronological age and small physical stature. However, as investigators systematically presented the undeniable physical evidence, including forensic links consisting of blue paint found on James's body that perfectly matched the paint found on the older boy's clothing, their unified defense violently fractured. The intense psychological pressure caused them to violently turn on one another, with each child desperately attempting to cast himself as a helpless, coerced bystander while accusing the other of initiating and executing the fatal, brutal violence. This staggering culmination of the investigative process exposed the terrifying reality that these two 10-year-olds possessed the full cognitive capacity to meticulously plan an abduction, execute a savage murder, and consciously attempt to conceal the biological evidence of their crime. The climax permanently broke the societal illusion that profound evil was strictly the domain of adulthood, forcing the legal system to confront the unprecedented nightmare of prosecuting children who possess the cold, calculating malice of seasoned, adult psychopaths. The subsequent criminal trial held in late 1993 was an internationally televised, emotionally volatile spectacle that required heavily reinforced security to protect the two juvenile defendants from the massive, furious crowds of protesters gathered outside the courthouse. The prosecution presented a mathematically precise, airtight forensic case, systematically disproving any notion of accidental death or innocent child's play, definitively proving that Venables and Thompson possessed complete malice aforethought and a clear understanding of the finality of their actions. The jury, visibly shaken by the extensive medical examiner's testimony and the brutal physical reality of the crime scene photographs, found both 10-year-olds guilty of murder, cementing their dark legacy as the youngest convicted murderers in modern English history. The presiding judge sentenced them to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, initiating highly controversial, specialized psychological rehabilitation programs designed specifically for juvenile offenders within secure, heavily guarded psychiatric facilities. Upon reaching adulthood in 2001, both perpetrators were granted release under highly secretive, lifelong conditions of anonymity, provided with entirely new identities funded by the state to protect them from widespread, highly organized vigilante retribution. While Thompson has seemingly integrated quietly into the shadows of society, Venables has subsequently reoffended multiple times regarding the possession of illegal, abusive digital materials, repeatedly violating the terms of his release and validating the public's lingering outrage. The horrific factual legacy of the Bulger case resulted in sweeping, permanent changes to the British judicial system regarding how violent juvenile offenders are investigated, prosecuted, and managed in the heavily scrutinized aftermath of their crimes. For the utterly devastated Bulger family, the legal outcome offered a hollow, bureaucratic finality that could never possibly replace the vibrant, innocent life that was violently stolen from them in a bustling shopping mall. This profound tragedy stands as a permanent, agonizing benchmark in forensic history, constantly reminding investigators that predatory darkness can occasionally reside behind the innocent, prepubescent faces of those we least suspect. Yet, as we transition our focus from the dense, urban environment of the United Kingdom to the remote, deeply forested rural landscapes of Missouri, we encounter another terrifying instance where adolescent malice meticulously masked itself, bringing us to the chilling, heavily documented diary of Alyssa Bustamante. Nestled within the rural, heavily forested landscape of central Missouri, the small unincorporated community of St. Martin's projected an atmosphere of enduring safety and quiet isolation, where neighbors knew one another and children freely roamed the vast expanses of nature. In the autumn of 2009, this peaceful environment provided an idyllic backdrop for the life of 9-year-old Elizabeth Alton, a cheerful, deeply innocent young girl who was affectionately known by her family and friends for her bright personality and love of the outdoors. Living just a short distance away through a patch of dense woods was 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, an adolescent who outwardly navigated the typical struggles of high school, but privately harbored a severe, escalating psychological darkness that went largely unnoticed by the surrounding community. Alyssa's internal life was defined by profound emotional turbulence, a documented history of severe self-harm, and an increasingly morbid obsession with violence that she carefully curated on various early social media platforms, completely masked from the trusting adults in her neighborhood. While Elizabeth spent her afternoons engaged in the innocent play of childhood, Alyssa was quietly retreating further into a deeply disturbed psychological space, meticulously contemplating the ultimate transgression of taking a human life purely to understand the sensory experience. The physical proximity of these two starkly contrasting lives, one defined by vibrant, uncorrupted innocence and the other consumed by a festering, predatory malice, created a volatile dynamic entirely hidden beneath the canopy of the Missouri woods. The local residents, comfortable in their geographic isolation, operated under the universal assumption that their greatest threats were natural elements, fundamentally incapable of recognizing that an apex predator was actively developing within the walls of a seemingly ordinary suburban home. Alyssa had spent days prior to the tragedy, physically preparing for her dark ambition, covertly digging 2 shallow graves in the forest behind her house, an act of chilling premeditation that silently awaited a victim of opportunity. This hidden architectural preparation transformed the peaceful woods from a childhood playground into a carefully engineered trap, establishing an invisible, fatal perimeter around the unsuspecting children of St. Martin's. The stark contrast between Elizabeth's trusting nature and Alyssa's cold, calculated preparations perfectly illustrates the terrifying reality that profound evil often gestates in absolute silence, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to violently intersect with innocence. The devastating collision of these two disparate worlds occurred on the early evening of October 21, 2009, when Elizabeth Alton asked her mother for permission to walk down the street to play with a friend who lived near the Bustamante residence. Trusting the familiar neighborhood and the short distance, her mother agreed, setting a strict curfew for the 9-year-old to return home before the autumn sun completely set and the rural roads plunged into darkness. When the designated time arrived and the shadows lengthened across the forested community, Elizabeth failed to walk back through her front door, immediately triggering a visceral, suffocating panic within her household that rapidly spread to the surrounding neighbors. Her mother frantically contacted the friend's family, only to learn that Elizabeth had supposedly left their house to walk back home much earlier, effectively establishing a terrifying void of time where the young girl had simply vanished into the twilight. Understanding the immediate, severe vulnerability of a child lost in the dense woods as temperatures began to drop, the family urgently contacted the Cole County Sheriff's Department, transforming a quiet Wednesday evening into a frantic, high-stakes emergency response. Law enforcement officers immediately descended upon the quiet streets of St. Martin's, activating emergency protocols and organizing preliminary search grids, while desperately hoping the situation was merely a case of a child losing her way in the darkening forest. Neighbors grabbed flashlights and poured out of their homes, forming ad hoc search parties that calmed the heavy brush and called out Elizabeth's name, their voices echoing off the trees in a desperate attempt to break the agonizing silence of the night. This sudden, chilling shift from a routine childhood playdate to a massive missing person crisis served as the definitive inciting incident, marking the exact moment the community's illusion of impenetrable safety was permanently shattered. The rapid mobilization of resources highlighted the sheer gravity of the situation. As the missing hours stretched out and the grim realization began to take hold that a 9-year-old girl could not simply disappear from a familiar path without the intervention of a malicious external force. As the first night surrendered to dawn without a single credible trace of Elizabeth, investigators understood they were no longer simply looking for a lost child, but actively racing against a terrifying, unknown threat operating within their own neighborhood. As the desperate search stretched into its second excruciating day, the localized effort rapidly expanded into a massive, multi-jurisdictional operation that brought in the Missouri State Highway Patrol, the FBI, and heavily trained search and rescue canine units to scour the unforgiving terrain. Helicopters equipped with advanced thermal imaging cameras continuously circled the skies above St. Martin's, while hundreds of dedicated volunteers shoulder-to-shoulder combed through the dense underbrush, meticulously documenting every discarded item and physical anomaly in the hopes of discovering a viable clue. Amidst the chaotic, highly visible search efforts, seasoned detectives began the quiet, systematic process of interviewing every individual residing in the immediate vicinity of Elizabeth's last known location, inevitably leading them to the doorstep of 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante. During these initial investigative interviews, law enforcement personnel immediately registered a deeply unsettling, highly suspicious disconnect in Alyssa's demeanor. While the rest of the community was paralyzed by grief and frantic anxiety, the teenager presented as remarkably calm, detached, and devoid of any appropriate emotional response. This glaring psychological red flag prompted detectives to dig aggressively into Alyssa's background, uncovering a highly disturbing digital footprint on platforms like YouTube and MySpace, where she openly listed her hobbies as cutting and killing, accompanied by photographs of self-inflicted wounds and aggressive posturing. Armed with this terrifying psychological profile, investigators focused intensely on the teenager, carefully cross-referencing her provided alibi against the established timeline of Elizabeth's disappearance and uncovering subtle, damning inconsistencies in her narrative regarding her movements that evening. The investigative tension mounted exponentially as law enforcement secured a search warrant for the Bustamante residence, bringing specialized forensic teams to meticulously comb through the teenager's bedroom in search of physical or documentary evidence linking her to the missing child. During the execution of this crucial search, detectives methodically processed the room, ultimately seizing a blue, seemingly unremarkable teenage diary that would completely blow the case wide open and provide an unfiltered window into the mind of a heavily premeditated killer. The discovery of this journal transitioned the entire operation from a desperate rescue mission into a hyper-focused homicide investigation, as the detectives prepared to confront the chilling reality hidden within its handwritten pages. The methodical, unyielding pressure applied by the investigative team slowly cornered the adolescent, systematically stripping away her fabricated innocence and forcing her into a position where her horrifying secret could no longer be contained. The absolute, terrifying climax of the investigation materialized within the sterile environment of the police precinct, where seasoned investigators meticulously analyzed the seized diary and uncovered a specific, freshly written entry dated the exact day of Elizabeth's disappearance. In a passage that profoundly disturbed even the most veteran law enforcement officers, Alyssa had explicitly, gleefully documented the brutal execution of the 9-year-old girl, chillingly describing the tactile sensations of strangling, slitting the throat, and stabbing the innocent victim. The entry concluded with a horrifyingly callous assessment of the murder, where the 15-year-old described the experience of taking a human life as amazing, and noted that the initial nervous anticipation quickly gave way to a profound, satisfying thrill. Armed with this indisputable, handwritten confession, detectives immediately brought Alyssa into the interrogation room. Confronting the seemingly apathetic teenager with her own damning words and the undeniable reality that her meticulously concealed crime had been entirely exposed. Faced with the overwhelming weight of her own documentation and the intense, unforgiving psychological pressure exerted by the interrogators, Alyssa's stoic facade finally fractured, leading her to formally confess to the premeditated slaughter of her young neighbor. In a grim, highly controlled procession, heavily armed law enforcement escorted the 15-year-old back to the very woods she had utilized as her hunting ground, forcing her to physically guide the investigative team through the dense brush to the exact location of the concealed, pre-dug grave. As crime scene technicians carefully excavated the shallow depression hidden beneath a thick layer of autumn leaves, they tragically recovered the mutilated remains of Elizabeth Olton, finding horrific biological confirmation of every violent detail Alyssa had arrogantly recorded in her journal. This devastating recovery provided the final, irrefutable puzzle piece, completely solidifying the forensic reality of the crime and definitively ending the agonizing, community-wide search that had consumed St. Martin's for 2 harrowing days. The climax forced society to confront the deeply unsettling reality that an adolescent girl, driven entirely by morbid curiosity and a psychopathic desire for a thrill, possessed the cold capacity to systematically butcher a trusting child who lived just down the street. The chilling transition from a diaries-written fantasy to a physical, blood-soaked crime scene forever altered the lives of everyone involved, permanently cementing Alyssa Bustamante as one of the most terrifying juvenile offenders in modern American history. The judicial resolution of this horrific tragedy required the Missouri legal system to navigate the complex, heavily scrutinized process of prosecuting a juvenile for a capital offense, ultimately resulting in Alyssa Bustamante being formally certified to stand trial as an adult due to the extreme, premeditated brutality of the murder. Facing a mountain of undeniable forensic evidence and her own explicit written confession, the defense strategy focused heavily on Alyssa's documented history of severe depression and psychological instability, attempting to mitigate the sheer malice of her actions by painting her as a deeply broken, heavily medicated adolescent. However, the prosecution systematically dismantled this narrative by emphasizing the chilling premeditation involved in digging the graves days in advance, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that she possessed a clear, calculated intent to hunt and destroy a human life. In 2012, mere weeks before her highly anticipated trial was set to commence, Alyssa accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action in a strategic maneuver to permanently avoid the possibility of the death penalty or an absolute sentence of life without parole. The presiding judge handed down a life sentence with the possibility of parole, accompanied by an additional, consecutive 30-year sentence for the weapons charge, ensuring that the admitted killer would remain locked away within the Missouri State Penitentiary system for the vast majority of her natural life. For the shattered Olton family and the traumatized community of St. Martin's, the sentencing provided a formal, legal finality to the nightmare, but it fundamentally failed to restore the profound sense of safety and innocence that was violently stolen from their quiet neighborhood. The case remains a dark, permanent benchmark in the annals of true crime, forcing mental health professionals and law enforcement to continually reevaluate the dangerous warning signs exhibited by profoundly disturbed adolescents in the digital age. The terrifying reality of her crimes demonstrated how easily extreme sadism can camouflage itself, waiting for an opportunity to strike the most vulnerable members of society. As we definitively close the agonizing file on Alyssa Bustamante's rural thrill kill, our investigation must leave the isolated woods of Missouri and travel across the northern border into the affluent, manicured suburbs of Ontario. This upcoming transition brings us face to face with an entirely different breed of predator, focusing on the heavily documented, collaborative horrors of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, where a seemingly perfect couple transformed their suburban home into a fortified chamber of nightmares. The affluent, manicured suburbs of southern Ontario provided a seemingly impenetrable veneer of respectability for Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, a young, highly attractive couple who projected the absolute embodiment of middle-class success in the early 1990s. Paul, an articulate, well-dressed accountant, and Carla, a beautiful veterinary assistant, presented a highly curated, aspirational public image that effortlessly charmed their neighbors, families, and colleagues throughout the quiet community of St. Catharines. Their fairy tale wedding in 1991, complete with horse-drawn carriages and lavish celebrations, further cemented their status as a perfect, deeply devoted pairing entirely insulated from the gritty realities of violent crime. They purchased a picturesque pink house situated at 57 Bayview Drive in Port Dalhousie, a tranquil neighborhood that felt light years away from any conceivable threat, meticulously decorating the interior to reflect their seemingly idyllic domestic life. However, behind the closed doors and drawn curtains of this suburban fortress, the couple fostered a profound, shared psychopathy, actively building a clandestine environment dedicated entirely to the execution of extreme sadistic violence. Paul had already established himself as a prolific, highly organized predator, secretly operating as the infamous Scarborough rapist, utilizing his unassuming charm to disarm victims before subjecting them to brutal assaults across the greater Toronto area. Rather than being repulsed by this horrific reality, Carla actively embraced his dark compulsions, willingly subduing her own moral boundaries to become a dedicated accomplice and a highly enthusiastic participant in his escalating predatory behavior. Together, they formed a deeply toxic, codependent mechanism of destruction, utilizing their trusting, attractive appearance as an effective camouflage, to continuously deflect any potential suspicion from local law enforcement or inquisitive neighbors. The community of St. Catharines viewed the residents of Bayview Drive through a lens of complete societal trust, entirely unaware that the meticulously maintained property housed a fortified dungeon equipped with restraints and recording equipment. This stark, terrifying dichotomy between their bright, heavily photographed public life and their deeply depraved, hidden reality perfectly illustrates how the most dangerous apex predators often rely on the illusion of normality to secure their hunting grounds. The stage was set within the walls of this seemingly perfect home, transforming a standard suburban residence into a highly controlled, inescapable nightmare for anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. The terrifying collapse of community safety in the Niagara region began in June 1991 with the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, who vanished from her own backyard in Burlington after being locked out of her family home late at night. The initial presumption of a typical teenage runaway was violently shattered weeks later when investigators made a horrific discovery in the shallow waters of Lake Gibson, a reservoir located a short distance from the Bernardo residence. Forensic dive teams recovered multiple concrete blocks containing the dismembered remains of the young girl, a gruesome, heavily premeditated disposal method that indicated the active presence of a highly organized, deeply sadistic killer operating within the area. The collective trauma inflicted upon the region was exponentially magnified in April 1992, when 15-year-old Kristen French was brazenly abducted in broad daylight from a church parking lot in St. Catharines while walking home from school. Multiple witnesses observed the terrifying sequence of events, describing two individuals forcing the struggling teenager into a beige Chevrolet Camaro, instantly confirming that a coordinated team of predators was actively hunting local adolescents. The discovery of Kristen's heavily abused remains weeks later in a remote ditch in neighboring Burlington sent absolute shockwaves of terror throughout the country, completely paralyzing the once peaceful suburban landscape. Parents fundamentally altered their daily routines, schools initiated severe lockdown protocols, and the entire community adorned their homes and clothing with green ribbons, symbolizing a desperate, unified hope for safety in the face of an invisible, merciless threat. This consecutive, brutal loss of two innocent teenagers served as the undeniable inciting incident that activated one of the most massive, highly publicized manhunts in Canadian history, completely overwhelming local police departments. The realization that these abductions were not isolated incidents, but rather the calculated work of a serial tandem utilizing a specific vehicle, forced law enforcement to rapidly reorganize their entire operational strategy to confront a highly mobile, lethal danger. The idyllic illusion of the Ontario suburbs was permanently shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of intense paranoia and grief as detectives desperately raced to identify the occupants of the beige Camaro before they could strike again. In response to the unprecedented public outcry and the escalating danger, law enforcement agencies consolidated their resources to form the Green Ribbon Task Force, a massive investigative unit tasked with processing thousands of public tips and cross-referencing criminal databases. The investigation became an arduous, deeply frustrating logistical nightmare, as detectives struggled to manage a sprawling suspect list, while simultaneously attempting to officially link the St. Catharines murders with the ongoing, parallel investigation into the Scarborough rapist. Despite his dark history in the Toronto area, Paul Bernardo managed to continuously slip through the investigative net, utilizing his clean-cut appearance, his marriage to Carla, and a series of alarming police miscommunications to evade serious scrutiny. He was interviewed by detectives and even provided a routine DNA sample as part of a massive, unprecedented dragnet aimed at identifying the Scarborough attacker. But massive backlogs in early forensic laboratories meant the biological evidence sat unprocessed for agonizing months. Meanwhile, within the terrifying confines of the Bayview Drive home, the internal dynamic between the two killers began to violently fracture, as Paul's deeply ingrained sadism increasingly turned inward, targeting his own wife with severe domestic abuse. The unified, impenetrable front they had presented to the world began to heavily crack under the weight of their shared atrocities and Paul's uncontrollable aggression, creating a volatile, highly dangerous environment that threatened to expose their dark secrets. Investigators remained entirely unaware that the primary suspect they were desperately hunting was actively crumbling under the pressure of his own violent compulsions, focusing instead on thousands of false leads and dead-end suspect profiles generated by a terrified public. The task force unknowingly possessed the biological key to solving the entire case sitting dormant in a laboratory, a tragic delay that allowed Bernardo and Homolka to maintain their freedom while the community remained paralyzed by fear. The relentless, exhausting police work continued to build a massive circumstantial perimeter around the region, slowly narrowing the geographical focus, but lacking the definitive physical link required to aggressively breach the front door of the St. Catherine's residence. It was only when the meticulously maintained facade of their marriage completely imploded into physical violence that the carefully constructed walls of their horrific enterprise finally began to collapse, providing detectives with an unexpected, unprecedented opening. The absolute, deeply disturbing climax of the investigation materialized in early 1993, not through diligent police work, but as a direct result of a brutal domestic assault that left Karla Homolka severely beaten and hospitalized by her husband. Recognizing that her life was in imminent danger, Homolka's family physically extracted her from the Bayview Drive home, prompting her to initiate contact with law enforcement and offer a sprawling, heavily manipulated confession to the task force. In a desperate bid to secure convictions in the highly publicized French and Mahaffey murders, the prosecution controversially negotiated a plea deal with Homolka, granting her a drastically reduced sentence in exchange for her full testimony against Bernardo, under the strict assumption that she was a reluctant, abused victim coerced into participation. However, the true horrifying reality of the case was exposed shortly after the agreement was legally solidified, when investigators comprehensively dismantled the St. Catherine's property and discovered a collection of highly explicit, heavily concealed videotapes hidden deeply within a recessed ceiling light fixture. These meticulously recorded tapes provided an unfiltered, scientifically indisputable visual record of the atrocities committed within the house, capturing every torturous moment inflicted upon Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. Most shockingly, the forensic video evidence completely destroyed Homolka's carefully constructed narrative of victimhood, definitively proving to seasoned detectives that she was not a terrified bystander, but an active, deeply enthusiastic orchestrator of the violence. The tapes also revealed the deeply buried secret that the couple had actively drugged and assaulted Karla's own younger sister, Tammy Homolka, resulting in her death a year prior, a tragedy the family had previously believed was a tragic accident. The discovery of these tapes hit the task force like a physical blow, transforming a seemingly straightforward narrative of a serial killer and his abused wife into a dark, complex reality of two equally culpable, highly sadistic predators. This undeniable, recorded evidence fundamentally shattered the foundational premise of the prosecution's strategy. Yet, due to the rigid nature of the Canadian legal system, the controversial plea agreement with Homolka could not be retroactively rescinded. The climax forced veteran detectives to watch the most horrific acts imaginable play out on television screens, providing absolute forensic certainty of the crimes, while simultaneously igniting one of the most intense, long-lasting public controversies in the history of the nation's justice system. The judicial resolution of the Scarborough crimes culminated in a highly secure, emotionally devastating trial in 1995, where Paul Bernardo was definitively convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated sexual assault based on the irrefutable evidence provided by the recovered videotapes. The presiding judge officially designated Bernardo as a dangerous offender, handing down a life sentence with absolutely no realistic hope of ever obtaining parole, ensuring that the highly organized predator would permanently remain within the maximum security wing of the Canadian penitentiary system. However, the profound public relief generated by Bernardo's permanent incarceration was heavily overshadowed by the intense, enduring outrage surrounding Karla Homolka's deeply controversial, immutable plea deal, which became famously known as the deal with the devil. Despite the undeniable video evidence proving her active, enthusiastic role in the torture and murder of multiple young women, including her own sister, Homolka was only required to serve 12 years for manslaughter, a legal outcome that fundamentally scarred the collective conscience of the nation. Upon her eventual release, she assumed a new identity and relocated, continuously haunting the Canadian public who firmly believed that a deeply culpable, sadistic killer had successfully manipulated the justice system to evade adequate punishment. The legacy of the Bernardo Homolka investigation forced sweeping, permanent changes in how law enforcement agencies process forensic evidence, manage multi-jurisdictional task forces, and critically evaluate the reliability of cooperating witnesses who possess high levels of psychopathy. For the devastated families of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Tammy Homolka, the legal proceedings provided an incredibly agonizing, highly fractured form of closure, permanently tethering their grief to a judicial compromise that prioritized expediency over absolute justice. The Pink House on Bayview Drive was eventually completely demolished to erase the physical monument to their atrocities, but the cold, factual reality of what occurred there remains a grim testament to the profound darkness that can thrive behind the facade of suburban perfection. From a couple who utilized a seemingly flawless marriage to conceal their predatory violence, our investigation must now transition to a dynamic where the illusion of severe medical tragedy was meticulously maintained to hide an entirely different form of abuse. We now turn our attention to the heavily documented, deeply unsettling reality of Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard, examining how a lifetime of fabricated illness eventually culminated in a desperate, highly premeditated act of violent liberation. In the quiet suburban community of Springfield, Missouri, a small, wheelchair-accessible pink house constructed by Habitat for Humanity stood as a powerful local symbol of resilience and charitable compassion. Residing within this brightly painted home were Dee Blanchard and her daughter, Gypsy Rose, a family unit that had successfully captured the hearts and financial support of their surrounding community and numerous national organizations. To the outside world, Dee projected the flawless image of an exhaustingly devoted single mother who had sacrificed her entire existence to care for a deeply fragile, terminally ill child. Gypsy Rose was presented to doctors, neighbors, and charities as a severely disabled individual suffering from a catastrophic cascade of medical conditions, including leukemia, muscular dystrophy, severe asthma, and a chromosomal defect that supposedly stunted her mental capacity to that of a 7-year-old. Confined to a wheelchair, relying on a feeding tube for basic nutrition, and often seen carrying a portable oxygen tank, Gypsy's physical appearance was meticulously curated to elicit profound, immediate sympathy from anyone who crossed her path. The community rallied intensely around the mother-daughter duo, providing them with immense financial donations. All expenses paid, trips to Disney World through the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and complimentary flights for highly specialized medical consultations across the country. Behind the closed doors of their seemingly warm and inviting home, however, a deeply sinister dynamic of absolute control and systematic physical abuse was being actively maintained entirely out of the public eye. Dee utilized extreme emotional manipulation and physical restraints to force Gypsy into compliance, subjecting the perfectly healthy girl to dozens of unnecessary surgical procedures, heavily sedating medications, and a completely fabricated reality where she was entirely dependent on her abuser. For over 2 decades, this impenetrable illusion of medical tragedy effectively shielded the household from any meaningful scrutiny, allowing a severe case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy to flourish under the guise of maternal devotion. The neighborhood continued to view the Blanchards as tragic but inspiring figures, entirely unaware that the most profound danger to Gypsy's life was not a phantom illness, but the very woman pushing her wheelchair. The carefully constructed, decades-long facade of the Blanchard household violently and inexplicably shattered on the afternoon of June 14, 2015, immediately plunging the quiet Springfield neighborhood into a state of profound confusion and terror. A highly disturbing, Expletive-laden message was suddenly broadcast from the joint Facebook account, shared by DD and Gypsy, aggressively stating that the mother was dead, followed by an even more graphic comment detailing a horrific assault. Deeply concerned friends and neighbors, knowing that such vicious language was entirely uncharacteristic of the deeply religious and gentle public personas the women maintained, immediately suspected that the account had been hacked or that a severe home invasion was currently in progress. Frantic calls flooded the local emergency dispatch, prompting the Greene County Sheriff's Office to deploy deputies to the Pink House on Volunteer Way to conduct an urgent wellness check on the vulnerable residents. Upon arriving at the property, responding officers found the residence entirely secured with no obvious signs of forced entry. But the eerie silence and the disturbing digital communication necessitated that they forcibly breach the front door to ascertain the safety of the occupants. As investigators systematically moved through the seemingly undisturbed, heavily medicalized home, they made a gruesome discovery in the master bedroom that instantly escalated the situation from a routine welfare check to a high-profile homicide investigation. Dee Blanchard was found lying face down in her bed, having succumbed to multiple, severe stab wounds to her back and neck that had been inflicted several days prior, indicating a brutal, highly personal attack. However, the most chilling aspect of the crime scene was not the presence of the deceased mother, but the absolute, terrifying absence of her severely disabled daughter, who was nowhere to be found on the premises. Officers noted with mounting dread that all of Gypsy's essential medical equipment, including her primary wheelchairs, oxygen tanks, and specialized medications, were left behind in the house, suggesting she had been forcibly abducted by the killer. This grim discovery served as the definitive inciting incident, instantly mobilizing a frantic, nationwide manhunt as law enforcement raced against time to locate a helpless, terminally ill kidnapping victim who they believed would not survive more than a few days without her critical medical life support, operating under the terrifying assumption that an extremely medically fragile hostage was in the custody of a violent murderer. Detectives immediately enlisted the assistance of federal agencies and specialized digital forensic units to trace the origins of the chilling Facebook post. Investigators urgently subpoenaed telecommunications and social media data, meticulously analyzing the digital footprint of the Blanchard account in a desperate attempt to establish a geographical vector for the fleeing suspect. The technological breakthrough occurred when cyber analysts successfully tracked the IP address responsible for the ominous post, decisively pinpointing the signal not to a local Springfield network, but to a residential address located hundreds of miles away in Big Bend, Wisconsin. Simultaneously, as detectives conducted deep background checks into the Blanchard family's history to identify potential enemies or estranged relatives, they began to uncover glaring, highly suspicious anomalies within Gypsy's extensive medical files. Investigators contacting previous physicians and reviewing hospital records discovered a shocking lack of empirical, biological evidence supporting any of Gypsy's claimed terminal illnesses, finding only notes that heavily relied on DD's own aggressive verbal assertions. The investigative team uncovered documentation from a pediatric neurologist who had previously examined Gypsy and explicitly noted strong suspicions of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a severe form of child abuse where a caretaker fabricates or induces illness in a dependent for attention. Furthermore, detectives interviewing neighbors and reviewing the physical evidence left at the crime scene found hidden documents, including a birth certificate that definitively proved Gypsy was not a teenager, as publicly claimed, but a 23-year-old adult woman. The parallel tracks of the investigation, the digital pursuit leading to Wisconsin, and the medical deconstruction occurring in Missouri, began to violently converge, forcing law enforcement to fundamentally reevaluate the entire premise of the kidnapping. The realization that the victim profile they had been aggressively broadcasting to the public was an elaborate, medically impossible fiction severely complicated the manhunt, as detectives realized they were likely tracking an entirely different dynamic than a standard abduction. Armed with the Wisconsin address and the rapidly unraveling truth about the Blanchard medical history, Local tactical teams coordinated with Wisconsin authorities to execute a high-risk raid on the identified property, preparing to confront the unknown individual who held the key to the bizarre, unfolding mystery. The absolute climax of the sprawling investigation erupted when heavily armed SWAT teams forcefully descended upon the residence of Nicholas Gojon in Big Bend, Wisconsin, executing a rapid, tactical breach to secure the premises and locate the missing woman. Inside the modest home, investigators successfully apprehended Gojon and, to their profound shock, discovered Gypsy Rose Blanchard alive, physically unharmed, and casually sitting in the living room, entirely devoid of any medical equipment. The veteran detectives from Missouri, who had arrived expecting to find a critically ill hostage clinging to life, were absolutely stunned when the 23-year-old woman independently stood up from a chair and walked toward them under her own unassisted power. This undeniable physical reality instantly shattered the two-decade-long illusion of her severe disability, completely appending the entire narrative of the case and transforming the perceived victim into a primary suspect within the homicide investigation. During the subsequent, highly intense interrogations, Gypsy waived her right to legal counsel and candidly confessed to detectives that she had meticulously orchestrated the murder of her mother as a desperate, final measure to escape a lifetime of torturous medical abuse. She revealed the existence of a secret, years-long online romantic relationship with Gojon, detailing how she had utilized hidden internet access to plan the assassination, ultimately inviting him to the Springfield home to execute the violent act while she hid in an adjacent bathroom. Gojon fully corroborated this account during his own interrogation, admitting that he had traveled to Missouri, retrieved a knife supplied by Gypsy, and brutally stabbed DD as she slept, driven entirely by his obsessive devotion to his online girlfriend. The investigation further confirmed that Gypsy had stolen thousands of dollars in cash from her mother's hidden safe following the murder, successfully facilitating their escape to Wisconsin via public transportation while actively masquerading as an ordinary couple. The revelation that the helpless, terminally ill child the entire country had been frantically searching for was actually a fully mobile, cognitive adult who had premeditated a brutal patricide left seasoned law enforcement officers entirely speechless. The deeply unsettling truth that Gypsy was simultaneously a victim of horrific, prolonged torture and the calculated architect of a first-degree homicide presented the justice system with an unprecedented, morally complex scenario that defied all conventional legal categorizations. The legal resolution of the Blanchard tragedy required the Missouri justice system to carefully navigate the extraordinarily complex intersection of severe, documented child abuse and calculated premeditated murder, recognizing the profound, undeniable psychological and physical torture Gypsy had endured for 23 years at the hands of her mother. Prosecutors opted against pursuing a capital murder trial, instead offering her a highly scrutinized plea agreement. In July 2016, Gypsy Rose Blanchard officially pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was subsequently sentenced to 10 years in a state penitentiary, a legally unprecedented outcome that acknowledged her status as both an abused victim and a willing conspirator. Conversely, Nicholas Gojon, the individual who physically carried out the brutal stabbing, was legally treated with far less leniency, as the court determined his actions were driven by cold malice and not a direct, biological imperative to escape physical captivity. Following a trial where his defense attempted to highlight his own cognitive limitations and extreme manipulation by Gypsy, a jury convicted Gojon of first-degree murder, resulting in a mandatory sentence of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The highly publicized nature of the convictions sparked intense global debates regarding the legal definitions of self-defense, the severe systemic failures of the medical community to identify prolonged abuse, and the psychological impact of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Having served 85% of her sentence, Gypsy Rose was granted parole and officially released from the Chillicothe Correctional Center in late 2023, stepping into a world she had never truly experienced as an autonomous, healthy adult. The factual legacy of the case stands as a permanent, chilling indictment of the medical systems that allowed extreme child abuse to masquerade as dedicated healthcare leaving behind a heavily documented trail of systemic blindness. As we close the file on a tragedy where severe parental abuse ultimately bred a fatal, desperate retaliation, our investigation must now pivot to examine a scenario where the domestic threat was entirely inverted. We must travel to the quiet, sun-soaked neighborhoods of Port St. Lucie, Florida, to confront the deeply disturbing case of Tyler Hadley, a teenager whose calculated malice directed toward his own parents transformed a typical suburban house party into a macabre, heavily documented crime scene. The sun-drenched suburban expanse of Port St. Lucie, Florida, characterized by its quiet streets and manicured lawns, provided the seemingly perfect backdrop for the middle-class existence of the Hadley family in the summer of 2011. Blake Hadley, a dedicated employee at a local power plant, and his wife Mary Jo, a beloved elementary school teacher, worked tirelessly to provide a comfortable, stable environment for their two sons. However, the tranquil facade of their household was constantly challenged by the increasingly erratic and defiant behavior of their 17-year-old son, Tyler Hadley, who had begun a rapid descent into substance abuse and severe mental health struggles. Tyler's daily life had become consumed by the use of illicit drugs, leading to a severe academic decline, frequent legal troubles, and a series of escalating, highly volatile arguments with his frustrated parents. Blake and Mary Jo desperately attempted to intervene, utilizing drug testing, imposing strict curfews, and seeking psychiatric help to rein in their son's deeply concerning rebellion, but their efforts only seemed to fuel his deep-seated resentment. Unbeknownst to his family, Tyler was secretly harboring intensely violent ideations, frequently expressing a chilling desire to murder his parents to his peers, who universally dismissed these statements as the dramatic, empty posturing of a troubled teenager. The tension within the walls of the Hadley home reached an absolute boiling point, creating a suffocating atmosphere where the parents lived in a state of constant, exhausting conflict with an adolescent who was quietly planning their execution. The local community and Tyler's social circle remained entirely oblivious to the severe psychological deterioration occurring behind the closed doors of the family residence, assuming his behavioral issues were simply the rebellious phases of a difficult youth. This dangerous combination of severe domestic friction, unchecked substance abuse, and ignored warning signs set the stage for a catastrophic psychological fracture. The quiet Florida neighborhood, completely accustomed to the peaceful rhythms of suburban life, was about to become the epicenter of a horrific crime that would permanently traumatize the local community and redefine the terrifying extremes of adolescent malice. The simmering domestic tension violently erupted into an unfathomable tragedy on the late afternoon of July 16, 2011, fundamentally severing Tyler's connection to reality and initiating a deeply macabre sequence of events. While his parents were quietly working at their computers in the family home, Tyler deliberately retrieved a framing hammer from the garage and brutally bludgeoned both Blake and Mary Jo to death in a sustained, frenzied attack. Immediately following the horrific double homicide, rather than fleeing the scene or contacting the authorities, Tyler meticulously dragged his parents' bodies into their master bedroom and spent hours attempting to clean the massive amounts of blood from the floors and walls. In a display of profound psychopathy that would later shock seasoned investigators, Tyler then logged onto his Facebook account and casually posted an open invitation to his peers, announcing he was hosting a massive house party that very evening. As the sun set over Port St. Lucie, dozens of local teenagers began pouring into the Hadley residence, completely unaware that they were actively drinking, playing games, and socializing mere inches away from a gruesome, freshly created crime scene. The blaring music, the chaotic energy of the underage drinking, and the dense crowd of oblivious high school students provided a surreal, terrifying camouflage for the atrocities that had been committed just hours prior. However, the fragile illusion of the social gathering began to crack when Tyler, heavily under the influence of drugs and alcohol, pulled his closest friend, Michael Mandel, aside to make a deeply disturbing confession. In a chillingly calm demeanor, Tyler explicitly informed Michael that he had finally followed through on his dark threats, explicitly stating that he had murdered his parents and that their bodies were currently hidden inside the locked master bedroom. This staggering admission, delivered amidst the loud, chaotic backdrop of a high school party, served as the definitive inciting incident that violently dragged a blissfully ignorant teenager into the center of a horrific forensic reality. The party continued to rage loudly in the living areas, completely juxtaposed against the terrifying, localized secret that was slowly beginning to circulate through the whispered conversations of the deeply unsettled adolescent crowd. Initially struggling to process the sheer gravity of the confession, Michael Mandel instinctively assumed that his friend was simply playing a deeply morbid, tasteless joke fueled by the heavy consumption of alcohol and narcotics. However, Tyler's persistent, eerie calmness and his aggressive insistence that the murders were a verifiable reality eventually convinced Michael to demand physical proof of the unthinkable crime. Tyler obliged, leading his friend down the hallway and briefly unlocking the door to the master bedroom, exposing Michael to a horrifying, blood-soaked scene that instantly shattered any lingering hopes of a fabricated story. Confronted with the undeniable, biological reality of the slaughtered parents hidden beneath a pile of household debris, Michael experienced a profound state of psychological shock, realizing that he was standing in the immediate presence of a double homicide. In a bizarre, highly controversial reaction driven by fear and panic, Michael took a quick photograph with Tyler before abruptly fleeing the chaotic residence, leaving the rest of the oblivious partygoers behind in the house of horrors. Once safely away from the property, the agonizing weight of the secret became entirely unbearable, prompting rumors to slowly leak through the tight-knit social networks of the local high school community as the night progressed. This localized spread of terrifying information eventually culminated in an anonymous, urgent tip being placed to the local Crime Stoppers hotline, detailing the horrific allegations and demanding immediate police intervention at the Hadley address. The Port St. Lucie Police Department, initially responding to what they believed was a standard noise complaint regarding an unruly teenage gathering, dispatched patrol units to the residence in the early, dark hours of Sunday morning. As law enforcement officers approached the property, they were met by the chaotic sight of dozens of intoxicated teenagers rapidly fleeing into the surrounding streets, completely unaware of the grim, underlying reason for the sudden police presence. This crucial transition from a localized neighborhood disturbance to a highly volatile, active police investigation marked the tense escalation of the case, setting the immediate stage for a confrontation between veteran officers and a heavily intoxicated adolescent killer. Upon entering the suddenly quieted residence, responding officers immediately noticed the lingering, heavy scent of cleaning chemicals masking a subtle, metallic odor, instantly elevating their suspicion beyond the parameters of a simple underage drinking violation. They encountered Tyler Hadley sitting alone in the living room. Noting that his pupils were severely dilated and his overall demeanor was characterized by a highly erratic, nervous energy that contradicted the typical behavior of a teenager caught throwing a party. When questioned about the whereabouts of his parents, Tyler attempted to maintain a fabricated narrative, nervously insisting that Blake and Mary, Joe, had traveled out of town to Georgia and had left him entirely alone for the weekend. However, the seasoned officers quickly identified glaring inconsistencies in his story, noticing subtle, missed drops of blood on the baseboards, and observing that the family's vehicles were still securely parked in the property's driveway. Driven by the anonymous tip and the escalating physical anomalies within the home, the officers focused their attention on the locked master bedroom door, which Tyler desperately, frantically attempted to prevent them from opening. Utilizing their operational authority under the exigent circumstances of a potential medical emergency, the officers decisively breached the locked door, stepping into a room that had been bizarrely and heavily barricaded from the inside with various pieces of heavy furniture. As they meticulously dismantled the makeshift barrier, moving aside dining room chairs, heavy towels, and miscellaneous household clutter, they made the devastating, Absolute discovery that completely solidified the anonymous allegations. Hidden beneath the massive pile of debris were the brutally battered, lifeless bodies of Blake and Mary Jo Hadley, positioned violently alongside the blood-stained framing hammer that had been utilized to end their lives. This horrific, undeniable physical revelation immediately shattered Tyler's fragile web of lies, transforming the suburban home into a heavily secured, high-profile major crime scene and concluding the terrifying hours of uncertainty. The climax of the investigation forced the officers to confront the chilling reality that a 17-year-old boy possessed the profound, cold capacity to massacre his own parents and subsequently entertain his friends mere feet away from their corpses. Faced with the overwhelming, irrefutable physical evidence contained within the master bedroom, Tyler Hadley was immediately placed under arrest by the Port St. Lucie police, securely transported to the local precinct, and formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The subsequent legal proceedings deeply captivated and horrified the state of Florida, as prosecutors presented a meticulous, heavily documented case that highlighted the sheer, calculated brutality of the attack and his profound lack of immediate remorse. The defense strategy heavily leaned on Tyler's extensively documented history of severe mental illness, clinical depression, and chronic substance abuse, desperately attempting to mitigate his culpability by framing the murders as the tragic endpoint of an untreated psychological collapse. In 2014, recognizing the severe premeditation of the crime, the presiding judge sentenced Tyler Hadley to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the dangerous predator would be permanently removed from civil society. Although his sentence was later subject to complex legal appeals and resentencing hearings, due to changing federal laws regarding juvenile offenders, he was ultimately resentenced to life, firmly cementing his status within the Florida state penitentiary system. The devastating factual legacy of the case permanently traumatized the local community, fundamentally destroying the perceived safety of their suburban environment and leaving the friends who attended the party to grapple with profound, enduring psychological guilt. The family home, forever tainted by the unspeakable atrocities committed within its walls, was eventually completely demolished, leaving an empty, silent lot that stands as a grim, physical reminder of the lives violently extinguished there. The undeniable reality of the case serves as a terrifying case study for behavioral analysts, illustrating how severe, untreated domestic hostility can rapidly escalate into catastrophic violence when coupled with adolescent impulsivity. As we move away from a teenager who violently snapped against his own bloodline and attempted to mask his crimes behind a chaotic social gathering, our investigation must now confront an entirely different form of public exhibitionism. We turn our focus to the heavily documented, digital manhunt of Amanda Taylor, examining a deeply disturbed young woman who actively utilized the internet not to hide her crime, but to proudly broadcast her brutal, premeditated revenge to the world. The rural landscapes of Montgomery County, Virginia, offered a quiet setting that sharply contrasted with the turbulent, grieving mind of 24-year-old Amanda Taylor in the spring of 2015. Amanda's life had fractured irrevocably in August 2014 when her husband, Rex Taylor, tragically committed suicide after a protracted and painful battle with severe drug addiction. Instead of processing her overwhelming grief through traditional channels, Amanda became deeply consumed by a profound, misplaced anger, actively seeking an external target to blame for the devastating loss of the father of her children. She increasingly directed this intense hostility toward her 59-year-old father-in-law, Charles Taylor, firmly and irrationally convincing herself that he was the primary catalyst who had introduced Rex to the narcotics that ultimately destroyed his life. As her resentment festered, Amanda began to heavily retreat into the darker corners of the internet, actively engaging with true crime communities and fostering a deeply disturbing obsession with serial killers and extreme violence. She utilized platforms like Tumblr and Instagram to curate a macabre digital persona, completely detaching herself from the reality of her responsibilities as a mother and morphing her profound grief into a dangerous, calculated desire for violent retribution. Her social media feeds, once filled with ordinary family updates, slowly transformed into a chilling echo chamber of weaponry, blood imagery, and cryptic threats of impending vengeance that her digital followers largely dismissed as performative, edgy online posturing. Meanwhile, Charles Taylor continued his quiet life in his Ellet area home, entirely unaware that his deeply troubled daughter-in-law was meticulously weaponizing her grief and actively recruiting an accomplice, 32-year-old Sean Ball, to help execute a devastatingly brutal home invasion. This toxic combination of unresolved trauma, digital radicalization, and misplaced blame created a highly volatile psychological environment that completely eradicated Amanda's moral boundaries, setting the absolute stage for a premeditated execution disguised as a twisted form of familial justice. The boiling point of Amanda's dark obsession finally spilled over into catastrophic, physical reality on the afternoon of April 4, 2015, when she and Sean Ball deliberately traveled to Charles Taylor's quiet Montgomery County residence. Operating under the guise of a routine, familial visit, the pair arrived heavily armed with a newly purchased bayonet-style knife, multiple stolen firearms, and a heavy tire iron that Ball intentionally concealed within his clothing. Once inside the home, as the unsuspecting Charles was comfortably seated on his living room sofa, Amanda abruptly and mercilessly initiated her long-planned revenge, aggressively standing over her father-in-law and plunging the bayonet into his body. As Charles desperately attempted to reach for the blade to defend himself against the sudden onslaught, Ball aggressively intervened, swinging the heavy tire iron and striking the older man multiple times in the head to break his resistance. Amanda continued her frenzied, deeply personal attack, ultimately stabbing Charles an astonishing 31 times with such extreme force that several of the lethal wounds completely penetrated through his neck and arm. The sheer, overwhelming brutality of the coordinated assault instantly transformed the quiet suburban living room into a horrific, blood-soaked crime scene, violently terminating the life of a man who was simply relaxing in the perceived safety of his own home. Before fleeing the devastated property, the pair callously stole money directly from the deceased victim's wallet and bizarrely informed Charles's bedridden, elderly father, who was in another room, that Charles had merely injured his leg and was being taken to the hospital. This brutal, heavily premeditated execution served as the undeniable inciting incident, instantly activating a complex homicide investigation and marking the exact moment Amanda transitioned from an online true crime enthusiast into a highly dangerous, active killer on the run. Rather than immediately attempting to conceal her horrific actions and quietly evade law enforcement, Amanda Taylor made an unprecedented, deeply chilling decision to actively broadcast her crime to the entire world, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the ensuing manhunt. Standing mere feet away from the mutilated body of her father-in-law, she deliberately posed for a photograph holding the blood-drenched murder weapon. A smirk plastered across her face, capturing a digital trophy of her perceived vengeance. Using Sean Ball's cellular phone, she immediately uploaded this gruesome image directly to her Instagram account, accompanying the horrifying visual with a remorseless, expletive-laden caption, where she proudly confessed to the murder and declared that she had done it entirely for Rex. She further distributed the crime scene photograph to an online acquaintance who operated a website dedicated to serial killers, actively seeking the dark notoriety and digital validation she had long obsessively consumed. As the shocking images rapidly circulated across social media platforms, deeply terrified friends and online followers frantically contacted the authorities, prompting local police to urgently descend upon the Den Hill Road residence, where they discovered Charles's body and confirmed the brutal reality of the digital posts. The realization that they were pursuing a highly armed, deeply unpredictable killer who was actively utilizing the internet to taunt the public instantly mobilized a massive, multi-state manhunt involving the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, and various state highway patrols. Amanda and Ball had stolen Charles's vehicle and fled south toward North Carolina, leaving behind a highly visible digital trail as Amanda continued to post ominous, threatening updates from the road. explicitly warning that more people would die if law enforcement continued to pursue her. The investigative tension mounted exponentially as detectives raced against time to intercept the heavily armed fugitives, desperately attempting to predict their erratic movements while managing the unprecedented public panic generated by a killer who was live blogging her escape. The intense, highly publicized manhunt reached its absolute, dramatic climax on the chaotic highways of North Carolina, but not before the volatile dynamic between the two fleeing accomplices violently imploded. As the immense pressure of the nationwide pursuit closed in around them, Sean Ball reportedly attempted suicide by overdosing on pills, but the situation rapidly deteriorated further when Amanda turned one of their stolen firearms against him, shooting her accomplice directly in the face and leaving him critically injured on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Abandoning the severely wounded Ball, who was later discovered by authorities clinging to life, Amanda continued her desperate flight alone, her digital bravado slowly unraveling as the overwhelming force of law enforcement aggressively tightened its perimeter. The final confrontation occurred on Interstate 40, where eagle-eyed troopers from the North Carolina State Highway Patrol positively identified her stolen vehicle, initiating a high-speed, dangerous pursuit that required immediate, decisive tactical intervention. Troopers strategically deployed spike strips across the highway, successfully puncturing the vehicle's tires and violently forcing the car to a grinding halt after a tense 2-mile chase, effectively neutralizing her only means of escape. Heavily armed officers rapidly swarmed the disabled vehicle, pulling the unrepentant 24-year-old from the driver's seat and securely placing her into custody, permanently ending her short-lived, deeply destructive reign of terror. This intense highway apprehension completely shattered Amanda's grandiose illusion of becoming an untouchable, infamous outlaw, physically forcefully dragging her from the lawless anonymity of the internet into the cold, heavily regulated reality of the criminal justice system. The climax of the case definitively stopped a heavily armed, highly motivated killer who had demonstrated a profound willingness to slaughter her own family, betray her closest accomplice, and actively threaten the general public for digital notoriety. The judicial resolution of this highly sensationalized tragedy culminated in a Montgomery County courtroom, where the prosecution presented an insurmountable mountain of evidence, heavily relying on Amanda Taylor's own explicit, proudly published social media confessions. Faced with her own undeniable digital documentation and the sheer brutality of the physical evidence, the jury required less than 30 minutes of deliberation to definitively convict Amanda of first-degree murder. During the trial, her chilling lack of remorse was on full display, as testimony revealed she had likened the thrill of the murder to riding a roller coaster, cementing her terrifying status as a cold, deeply calculated predator. The presiding judge subsequently handed down a mandatory life sentence, ensuring that the self-proclaimed selfie killer would spend the absolute remainder of her natural life secured within the Virginia State Penitentiary system, entirely cut off from the online audience she so desperately craved. Sean Ball, having miraculously survived the gunshot wound to his face, fully cooperated with investigators and pleaded guilty to his role in the premeditated assault, ultimately receiving a sentence of 41 years in prison. The tragic legacy of Charles Taylor's murder serves as a profound, deeply disturbing warning regarding the dangerous intersection of unresolved grief, extreme online radicalization, and the performative nature of violence in the modern digital age. The case forced law enforcement to rapidly adapt to a new breed of offender who utilizes social media not merely as a communication tool, but as a primary weapon of psychological terror and public grandstanding. As we conclude our agonizing journey through these 10 heavily documented, undeniable realities, we must take a final moment to reflect on the overarching darkness that connects these disparate tragedies, bringing us to the chilling conclusion of our investigation. As we close the investigative files on these 10 devastating realities, we are left to grapple with one haunting question. If the absolute purest forms of malice can seamlessly incubate behind the innocent faces of youth and the quiet facades of suburban life, how can we ever truly be certain of what is developing behind the closed doors of our own neighborhoods? Thank you for watching.